Welcome, everyone, to the fourth annual Emerging Scholar Symposium, a partnership brought to you specifically by the Roosevelt, Truman, and Eisenhower Presidential Libraries, and we list them in order that they served, and more broadly from the National Archives and Records Administration, of which the Presidential Libraries are an important part. The Emerging Scholar Symposium is the brainchild of my friend and colleague, Joy Murphy, who is the Director of Learning and Engagement at the Eisenhower Presidential Library and Museum. And it's a program that brings you, the viewer, cutting-edge insight and information from a group of scholars who are relatively new to the world of research, scholarship, and the presentation of their findings on a national stage. So we're getting in on the ground floor of what I'm sure are going to be some fantastic careers and some world-class research, writing, and education. I'm Jeff Urban. I am the Education Director at the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum. I'll be your host and moderator for today's session. And I'm so pleased that you've taken time out to find some time to come here and listen to these fantastic scholars as they share their research with us. This year's theme is this idea of waging peace. And I would like to point out that that is exactly what each of the three presidents associated with this symposium was seeking to do. Though they were associated with World War II, the Korean War, and the Cold War, each of them was trying to bring about peace among all peoples and peace among all nations. That was at the core of their administrations. Next, we're going to talk with Dr. Kaete O'Connell. Kaete can be found at Yale University, where, among other things, she is a lecturer in global affairs in the Jackson School of Global Affairs. She's also assistant director of the Brady Johnson Program in Grand Strategy. She earned her doctorate in history at Temple University, an MA with the Federated Department of History at Rutgers University, and a BA in history at Drew University. She has a manuscript in progress and under contract with University of Virginia Press. And the title is Tasting Freedom, U.S. Occupied Germany and the Origins of Cold War Food Diplomacy. Kaete, thank you so much for being with us. Can you share with us what you've been learning and what you've been researching?
Absolutely, Jeff. Thank you, and thank everyone at the Presidential Libraries for having me aboard today and giving me this opportunity to share some of my research with all of you. So my research is primarily focused on U.S. food policy in occupied Germany, as the title suggests right here. And I wanted to open up today with a snippet from Life magazine's Christmas 1945 issue. In December 1945, Life magazine published an editorial that was commenting on the stark differences between the pretty much joy of the holiday season for the victorious Allies as it compared to the situation in Europe in liberated territories. And so Life magazine, they talk about the post-war extravagance of the United States. Mink coats for sale, perfumes, ferocious Los Angeles shoppers. And they contrast that with the bleak situation that's facing cold, hungry Europe. And hunger is a key part of this. In December 1945, American food consumption was on the rise, and it was pretty steady. Americans were consuming, on average, 3,300 calories a day. The liberated nations of Europe, places like France, the Netherlands, Belgium, they were struggling to achieve 2,000 calories daily, which was what most nutritional scientists recommended. German consumption fell well below the 1,500 calories a day that the Allied governments had imposed as a daily ration for a normal consumer. And when they use the term normal consumer, they're talking about your average adult, not someone who's engaged in any sort of heavy labor and not someone who is elderly, ill, or a child. So this editorial, it started off, presenting this great scene of the first post-war Christmas. But halfway through, it began to point out some really stark ironies and contradictions within US policy. It urged Americans to recognize their post-war responsibilities, going so far as to claim that the refusal to allow private relief agencies to operate in Germany was cruel. It said, quote, if we hold the individual German responsible for not investigating Belsen and doing something about it, will we not one day be judged for our present apathy? Only 2 weeks earlier, the British Army had hung the 11 SS defendants who were found guilty of war crimes at the Belsen trials. Scores of film and photographic evidence supported the prosecution's claims that what occurred in Bergen-Belsen was not simply criminal neglect, but was the result of deliberate starvation. Life's editorial drew very clear and explicit connections between the genocidal policies of the Third Reich and US food policy in occupied Germany. Now, this is not the narrative that I was familiar with growing up. The stories I knew from my history class, as well as from my grandparents who were German immigrants, they were stories of goodwill and friendship. They were stories about the Berlin airlift and candied parachutes floating down to children, or care packages like the one in this title scene here, that were provided for German families shipped by Americans to counterparts overseas. And so my research takes this contradiction as its starting point, and it charts the evolution of US food policy in occupied Germany, tracing the development and implementation and eventual embrace of these US food programs. The resulting story is not just a tale of post-war relief and recovery. Instead, it reveals how these policies anticipated and in many ways exacerbated tensions with the Soviet Union. So this is a story about food as a weapon of war, but also a tool for peace. Food is foundational. It's something that every living creature requires. And the fact that it is a necessity for survival made it incredible political leverage and propaganda as relations with the Soviet Union soured. Food, its production, its provision, and its consumption really lies at the heart of the Cold War. Next slide. Now, to understand food's role in the occupation and the peace, you have to understand food's role in the war. Throughout the conflict, Allied and Axis nations implemented strategies to reorganize their economies and exploit resources. But no nation was positioned quite as well as the United States to do so. Freedom from want wasn't just some lofty ideal expressed in FDR's 1941 State of the Union. It was actually attainable in the United States. Recognizing that he needed to mobilize a skeptical public, as well as the resources of a nation that was struggling to emerge from an economic depression, President Roosevelt spoke of threats to democracy, the defense of freedom, and American security. To better convey the stakes, he offered his own personal vision for a post-war future, a future that was founded upon 4 essential freedoms. These human freedoms included the freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. Now, freedom from want underscored the importance of economic security, but Roosevelt's description in that speech in the State of the Union was vague. He referred to economic understandings that will secure to every nation a healthy peacetime for its inhabitants everywhere in the world. And it wasn't really until Norman Rockwell illustrated this in the first image that you see there, that people were really starting to see what freedom from want could entail. It eliminated any sort of ambiguity. Allied victory, according to Roosevelt, and this is before the United States had even entered the conflict, Allied victory would guarantee economic prosperity and food security for everybody. Now, the transition to a wartime economy happening in early 1942, it transformed not only American industry, but also American agriculture. The Department of Agriculture worked closely with several divisions to really better organize the war effort and educate the American public. So they worked closely with the Office of War Information, the Office of Price Administration, and the War Production Board. And throughout all of this, they were very keen on producing materials that provided information, but also served as really pivotal and emotional sources of propaganda. And you see examples of that in the slide here. Militarized language and imagery abounded throughout these materials. In January 1943, President Roosevelt declared the day Farm Mobilization Day. He matter-of-factly told Americans, quote, "Food is a weapon in total war. While our enemies employ it cold-bloodedly to weaken or exterminate the peoples of the conquered countries, the United States was using food to, quote, earn the friendship of people in liberated areas and to serve as a promise and an encouragement to peoples who are not yet free. And you see in these various images here, the ways in which food is kind of used to entice those who are considered victims of the war and to provide the necessary support, the sustenance that they need, but also the fact that food is, as it says quite bluntly, a weapon. Don't waste it. And so the Roosevelt administration knew that in order to win total war, you needed the entire population to be mobilized, and that included those elements of the population that you wouldn't necessarily associate with war. So agriculture was clearly just as important as industry. They also created a program known as Food Fights for Freedom. This campaign really reinforced Roosevelt's classification of food as a weapon of war, and it associated food not only with victory, but with a, quote, broader concept embracing a lasting peace and post-war responsibilities. So it grew increasingly clear in all of this language and all of this material that's being produced by the various departments, including the Department of Agriculture, that food was essential for future political and economic stability. Even the Department of Agriculture's secretary, Claude Wicard, decided to update the World War I slogan that said, "Food will win the war," and he changed it and added a line saying, "Food will win the war and write the peace." And this is because he believed that defeated nations would be more amenable to US peace terms if American food accompanied that occupation. But not everybody agreed with this. Next slide. Food lay at the core of some of the most controversial and divisive debates concerning occupation policy in post-war Germany. Disagreements over the nature and extent of a hard peace revealed stark divisions within Roosevelt's cabinet and threatened to undermine negotiations between the big three. By the big three, I mean Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, later Truman. So these three individuals met regularly to discuss what they were going to do after victory was theirs. And a lot of the language that they were tossing around was this question of a hard or a soft peace, which is really just their way of discussing whether they were going to pursue a punitive occupation or a rehabilitative one. And this conversation is heavily informed, or maybe even haunted, really, by experiences that occurred in the previous World War. So these individuals, the leadership, the big three, they recognized that the peace terms that had been agreed to at Versailles in 1919 had really contributed to the rise of National Socialism in Germany. And these Allied planners, they began debating the merits of a prolonged military occupation. They thought that they were too soft in their earlier treatment of Germany, and many of them favored punitive policies. In practice, this so-called hard peace restricted civilian access to humanitarian aid, specifically much-needed food relief. Within President Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, 3 separate plans actually arose to address questions of food security in the US zone of occupation. The State Department, led by Cordell Hull, proposed 2,000 calories a day. This was the standard. This is something that medical doctors and nutritional scientists had agreed upon as the necessary intake for any average normal consumer. Not impressive by modern standards, it was actually more than Hitler had provided in 1945. So by the end of the war in Germany, many Germans were actually struggling to be able to attain 2,000 calories a day. On the other side of the debate was Henry Morgenthau's Treasury Department. Now, it may seem odd that Treasury inserted itself in a policy conversation about the occupation of Germany, and it was odd. And it was actually a very bad PR moment for the Roosevelt administration. Morgenthau proposed what ended up being known as the Morgenthau Plan, and he wrote a book about it later after the war, which you see there, Germany is Our Problem. And Morgenthau's plan suggested a paltry 1,000 calories a day. He from Germany, and he felt that the country should return to a pastoral state. And this created a lot of controversy, not only within Roosevelt's cabinet, but also at a really pivotal moment during the re-election campaign of 1944. Roosevelt struggled to get people to realize that this was just a proposal, that it was not something that he, quote, signed on to, even though there had been discussion at the Quebec conference with Churchill about initiating this. And the final idea, or the final proposal, calorie-wise, was the War Department's proposal for 1,500 calories, which ended up being bumped up to 1,550 once the occupation began. This was the winning proposal, and it was adopted in April of 1945 as the directive to the Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Occupation Forces. This directive is commonly known as JCS 1067. Next slide. So JCS 1067 is something that Truman signs off on in April of 1945, just as the war is coming to a close. This would inform the way that he interacted with both Churchill and Stalin at the Potsdam conference that summer in 1945, but it also set the tone for the occupation from the start. You see here, it states quite simply, you will estimate, and this is a directive to the military, to military government, you will estimate requirements of supplies necessary to prevent starvation or widespread disease or such civil unrest as would endanger the occupying forces. So this was the metric that was being employed. This is what they were going to use. And it really clearly states that the concern here isn't really the well-being of civilians, it's the well-being of the occupying forces. Questions of disease, it was not about diseases running rampant with the civilian population, it was the close quarters with the occupying army and German civilians. You did not want a disease outbreak, especially not anything that could come close to the influenza epidemic that occurred after World War I. There was also a real concern about civil unrest, and that reflected again, a history lesson, looking back at World War I and a lot of the political unrest that occurred throughout Europe in the aftermath of that conflict. And so there was a worry and a fear that hungry people are desperate people, and desperate people would not only create strife and would be difficult to govern, but they also might embrace political ideologies that were not favorable to the United States government, such as communism. So in this post-war landscape, calories, this really peculiar unit that's used to measure energy, provided this metric for punishment. And at the core of each of the proposals that the State, War, and Treasury Department provided was a fear that any sort of miscalculation would tip the balance of power in favor of the Soviet Union. So post-war Germany becomes this site of complex food negotiations. And all of these transactions are occurring against the backdrop of the burgeoning Cold War. Now, when Truman assumed the presidency, he publicly affirmed continuity with Roosevelt's plans for peace. But the occupation was never something that really interested FDR. He was more concerned with the United Nations than he ever was in intervening in cabinet disputes over their preferred methods of pacification. Embarrassed by the public response to Morgenthau's proposal for an agrarian Germany, Roosevelt decided to postpone discussions on occupation policy. He wanted to wait. The Treasury Department did not want to wait, and they continued to meddle in the planning, and they were likely responsible for the inclusion of this disease and unrest line in JCS 1067. Next slide. Now, in the summer of 1945, Truman, Churchill, and Stalin meet in Potsdam, which is a suburb of Berlin. And here they decide on how they're going to officially occupy Germany. You see here that there are 4 different occupation zones: the Soviet, the British, the American, and the French zone, which was created from donations, essentially, from the British and American. That's why you see almost 2 separate triangles that barely meet. And the capital city of Berlin, which is there in a red circle in the Soviet territory, is also listed as under joint administration. Now, looking at this map, one of the things that's really important to know is most of the agricultural areas are technically in the Soviet zone and also in the area that is now listed as Polish administration. So much of the land that provided the food for Germany ended up no longer being German territory or was held under the Soviet Union in the Soviet zone. Bavaria, located in the American zone, was more rural, but it was not able to produce enough food to feed the British, the French, and the American zones. So much of the debate that's occurring at the Potsdam Conference is really a matter of how severe this occupation, how severe this peace is going to be for Germany. Now, Congress and the American public, they remain very hesitant to assume the financial burden of relief and recovery, not just for Europe as a whole or the world as a whole, but very specifically for defeated Germany. Many Americans remembered how much money was loaned to European nations after World War I. President Truman wrote to his wife Bess from Potsdam in July 1945, and he said that he was, quote, certainly not going to pay reparations, feed the world, and get nothing for it but a nose thumbing. One of his mantras that he adopted when he went to Potsdam was that Santa Claus was dead, which was his way of kind of acknowledging the fact that so many people referred to the United States and Uncle Sam really as this figure, as a Santa Claus for the world. Now, throughout the negotiations at Potsdam, Churchill and Stalin fought bitterly over questions of reparations, territory, and specifically food. Churchill knew that the British zone was in the heavily populated industrial regions of Germany, and he felt that they were not going to be able to provide enough food to sustain that population, and that that was an obligation they had as an occupying force in that area of Northwest Germany. Stalin didn't really seem interested. He suggested that the British, if they were that concerned, they could purchase bread from Poland. Next slide. Now, Allied leadership did agree to enforce a lower standard of living on Germany. They were convinced that a punitive occupation was the best insurance against future conflict. Yet the country had never actually been self-sufficient when it came to food. Hitler's ruthless exploitation of occupied territories improved the food supply within German borders, but the experience was really short-lived. Losses on the battlefield destabilized food systems throughout Europe, and it resulted in widespread shortages that were exacerbated by the retreating German army's destruction of transportation networks. So when Allied doctors and nutritional scientists agreed on 1,500 or 1,550 calories as the daily ration, it was rooted in a belief that this was just enough to sustain the population, to prevent widespread disease outbreaks and curb unrest. But this formula was calculated in a lab and really failed to account for numerous variables when put into practice. As winter approached, military leadership grew increasingly concerned. All of a sudden, they started to become aware of the fact that surrounding them were hungry people. And one of the things that's really important to parse out in this moment is the fact that it is really easy to identify starvation because it results in death, essentially. But it was much more difficult to kind of calculate and see hunger. And the images before you all come from the National Archives, and they show the situation in Germany in the summer of 1945. Many Germans, especially in urban areas, did not have access to food, at least not the way they did prior to the war, and not like their neighbors in more rural areas. So many relied on the black market in order to kind of bolster what they were receiving in their official ration. And the other problem was an official ration just tells you what people are supposed to get. It doesn't tell you what they're actually consuming. And so these images here show people rummaging through garbage, essentially. And this is probably the most drastic measures that are taken. People did go out into the countryside. They foraged for potatoes. They bartered in the black market for whatever they could find. Occasionally, American GIs would feel sorry, especially when they saw a hungry child, and they would share some of their rations. But increasingly, it became much more difficult to justify the hard peace. This ended up becoming a PR problem, and they didn't want it to become a PR nightmare. Now, as winter approached, military leadership recognized that this isn't just about the health and safety of occupying forces, it's really about the health and safety of the entire population here in Germany, but on the ground in Europe as a whole. In October of 1945, the British decide that they're going to reverse their policy. They're going to allow aid for German civilians. They felt that this would make the occupation more palatable for British citizens. And keep in mind, this wartime ration system in Britain, it continued after the war. It was not lifted until 1954. So the British have their own austerity measures, but they are willing to allow humanitarian organizations to come into their zone and to provide relief to the German population. Next slide. So, aware of this growing criticism, President Truman tasks the former director of the Office of Censorship, Byron Price, with a study of Allied policy in Germany. Now, prior to the release of his full report, Price had sent a preliminary outline to General Eisenhower in October. And he wrote, quote, "The American army is organized and trained to win wars, not to administer civil governments." Now, this statement's really important because this was part of the argument and the quarreling that was going on between the State and War Department, is whose responsibility it was to govern Germany after the war had ended. So Price's report eerily echoes these debates that had occurred in Roosevelt's cabinet a full year earlier. Now, Price toured Germany for 10 weeks. Following this trip, he urged a reassessment of existing policy. He believed that the army was doing good work, but that the conditions on the ground made this work incredibly difficult. He advised an increase in the calorie ration and the calories to 2,000. He said that if the United States hoped to prevent starvation, epidemics, and rioting, that he rejected the idea that the ration of 1,550 was satisfactory. He believed that it was barely adequate for individuals living under normal circumstances, let alone those who were, quote, expected to work and who have no heat at home and no way to reach their places of employment except by walking. So he points out a lot of factors that weren't actually considered by the administration when they were, trying out these different caloric calculations. If you don't have heat, your body has to work harder to keep itself warm. If you don't have transportation, you're exerting more energy in order to get to wherever you need to go, whether that's to work, whether that's to school if you're a child, or whether that's to a market where you're going to be standing in line pretty much all day waiting for your bread ration. Now, Price explained that food imports did not imply that the US would be, quote, soft with the German people, but instead that they represented protection to our own occupation troops against disease and disorder, and importantly, decency toward our allies of Western Europe, themselves undernourished and easily susceptible to disease. So he's recognizing the fact that immune systems across the continent they're compromised, and that if you risk having something happen in Germany, it could easily spread across the European continent. Now, the Price report presented a rationale for aid that demonstrated the power of US food to combat the triple threat of starvation, disease, and unrest. Clearly, food was necessary to keep the peace and protect American troops. This appealed to both the State and War Departments. Next slide. It was also language that humanitarian organizations quickly latched onto and adapted to suit their arguments as well. Now, one of the moves that Roosevelt did take in order to kind of anticipate the relief that was going to be necessitated at the end of the war was the creation of the United Nations Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, UNRWA. And UNRWA was created in the late months of the war, and it was designed to provide aid and resources to the European populations. UNRWA, however, was not permitted to provide any aid to German civilians. All UNRWA operations within German territory were only used to provide aid to displaced persons and other victims of the Nazi regime. So these different humanitarian organizations, they latch on to the fact that suddenly the military is paying attention to calorie calculations. And military government, they are collecting data endlessly throughout the fall of 1945. They are providing the numbers. They are doing weighing programs. You see here a photo of one of those weighing programs. They have children. They're taking their heights and weights and their measurements. But they're paying really close attention to, questions of abnormality, what falls outside the zone. And the photo of the two babies is striking. Both of these babies are 9 months old, and both of them are underweight. The larger child is only underweight by 4 pounds. The smaller child weighs only 7.5 pounds. And it was images like these that are being produced both by the military and by humanitarian organizations that are touring Europe, that are trying to get the American public on board and pressure Congress to pressure Truman to change US policy, that are circulating at this time. So hunger is impossible to measure, but there are so many photographs of it. There's so much visual evidence of it. You could not assign a numeric value, but even the Weekly Information Bulletin, which was a periodical produced by the Office of Military Government, it wryly noted the fact that, quote, public health and preventative medicine can be measured only by its failures. So that was something that they were trying to point out. And by focusing on children, different humanitarian organizations were really able to get the momentum that they needed to force Truman to change policy. And part of the way they did this was by uniting their humanitarian cause with a security concern, specifically the threat of communism. And General Lucius Clay, who would become military governor of Germany after Eisenhower left, he said it quite bluntly, and that quote is featured here. There's no choice between becoming a communist on 1,500 calories and a believer in democracy on 1,000 calories. And that's the way people started to think about the food problem in Germany. Next slide. So in anticipation of a policy change following the Price report, the American Council of Voluntary Agencies for Foreign Service created a committee composed of different representatives who are interested in assisting German civilians. These representatives accompanied sympathetic congressmen and other officials on highly publicized tours of the US zone throughout the fall. Their persistence paid off when the President's War Relief Control Board, motivated by findings of the Price report, approved an inquiry into the German food situation. This Voluntary Agencies Council then quickly sent a group over who arrived in mid-January 1946. So they're there right at the height of winter. They met with military officials and leaders of German welfare organizations throughout the Western zones, but they were not permitted in the Soviet zone. While the mission toured Germany, their committee created the Council of Relief Agencies licensed for operation in Germany. They love acronyms, and that is KRALOG, which is listed right there. KRALOG was originally composed of 11 agencies, and they organized overseas relief. They intended, because this still hadn't been approved yet, to serve as a liaison between the federal government and members on the ground in Germany. They basically wanted to serve as the managers for German relief. Now, the report that they circulated following their January trip, it painted a bleak picture. It was informed by scientific data and interactions with the German populace. It documented inconsistent and insufficient caloric intakes alongside these gut-wrenching personal tales of hunger and deprivation. One team member wrote in his diary, quote, "There is an expressionless character about the faces of the people." The concluding report stated that, quote, "The bare statistics do not tell the story of the hungry people we have seen, the old who are not getting enough to eat, the children who need more than bread and potatoes for food." The report echoed testimony in Congress where the debate was framed as a question of American decency. Christian charity, common sense, and justice, declared Senator Wiley, demanded that we prevent inhuman suffering among our former foes and among our former allies. So this was no longer a question of a hard or soft peace, but a question of American honor and the basic humanitarian impulse of the American people. It's this humanitarian impulse that slowly overpowered anti-German sentiments in the United States. On February 19th, Truman approved food imports for the US zone, and he publicly endorsed KRALOG. He also purchased the first care packages for German families. CARE had been a humanitarian organization that was created in the aftermath of the war. They had purchased a number of military rations that were known as 10-in-1s. You see the boxes in the picture there. And these boxes were surplus because the war ended quicker than they thought. And it was designed, each package was designed to provide enough food for 1 soldier for 10 days or 10 soldiers for 1 day. And so these original care packages were able to be purchased by Americans and designated for specific families and individuals across Europe. The first care packages arrived in Germany in August of 1946. So Truman, in February, he approves food imports for Germany. And at the same time, he also had tasked, a few weeks earlier, former President Herbert Hoover to tour the globe and come up with a assessment of the world food situation. They were concerned that famine was imminent. Former President Hoover travels with a group of individuals who assisted him in his post-World War I relief campaigns. And he too urged relief and recovery for Germany. And he took the lead in creating these special school feeding programs, which are pictured to the right, the large group of children there, as an effort to supplement calories for children while they attended school. So by the spring of 1946, the US administration of Harry Truman, as well as the military government, they kind of come together and recognize the fact that the situation in Germany is becoming untenable. Something has to be done, or this winter, which was bad, would be even worse the following year. And they saw this. They saw the threat of unrest and disease in the numbers. In addition to providing information on malnutrition throughout the German population, there was also an incident where there was a food uprising in Hamburg, which was the British zone of occupation, in March. And this kind of provided the proof that was needed and validated the decision to allow food to be imported into the US zone. So throughout the summer of 1946, we see all these different organizations coming together and effectively changing US policy toward Germany. And this would all come to a head in September of 1946, when Truman's Secretary of State, James Burns, would announce a restatement of German policy. And when he gives this restatement, he's A, announcing that the British and US zones are going to merge, but B, he's also talking about a change in priorities. And he specifically states that Americans, quote, have long since ceased to talk of a hard or soft peace for Germany. What we want is a lasting peace. And it was key that food was key to this lasting peace. Next slide. So, in conclusion, what I have found is that food really created the situation, or provided the interest in the German people that was necessary to kind of change the course of history. This relationship between the United States and Germany would not have been possible had food imports not been allowed in the winter of 1946. The US zone, it really provided a lab for divergent interest groups to experiment. They were experimenting with nutritional needs. They were experimenting with different feeding practices, technical assistance, and economic development. All of these would become buzzwords during the Cold War. The formal and informal transactions that occurred in post-war Germany demonstrated that American power didn't need to be measured by military might alone. Food could cultivate national prestige. So we see here this moment when calories serve as this new calculus for international relations, but also for security. Food aid was more than a humanitarian policy. It became a piece of a much larger strategy that linked food security with national security in the early Cold War. The food diplomacy practiced by the United States government amassed the nation's surplus and distributed it to friends and foes in search of economic and political stability. The material that was distributed in occupied Germany served a greater purpose than just emergency relief and economic recovery. It was laden with symbolism. It was political leverage in the Council of Foreign Ministers and a beacon of hope for the hungry German. Food bridged cultures, and its reception and consumption proved as crucial as its provision. The food and feeding programs pursued by military government included everything from the unofficial gifting of Hershey bars to the delivery of 2,000 tons of foodstuff daily to West Berlin during the blockade of 1948-49. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate. We've got some questions and comments that have come in. Michael B. says, a very informative thesis on post-war hunger, far different from the Hollywood image we have of American soldiers handing out candy bars to children. Cam T says, great presentation. You have a great career ahead of you. And I would echo that as well. And then Cam T goes on to say, great topic, as yesterday was the anniversary of General George Marshall's speech at, and I'm sorry I have to say this, Harvard, outlining what became known as the Marshall Plan. Another question that has come in is, what was the reaction of ordinary people, given the fact that Americans had just gone through the Great Depression, which was obviously a time of food scarcity, and then the war, which was also a time of food scarcity. Did the average American really care at this point, or was it just like, look, we've sacrificed, they started the war, we won, so sorry about that? Or what was the attitude?
Primarily, people were annoyed. They did not want to see, they didn't want to see the United States once again bailing out Germany, providing them with money, providing them with food, any sort of materials that would be necessary to rebuild and to achieve any sort of stability, whether that's political or economic. Opinion polls throughout 1944 and 1945, Americans overwhelmingly supported a hard peace. And really, one of the things that I didn't get into in this particular presentation, one of the things that eroded this commitment to the hard peace and this commitment to this food ban were the relationships that developed between American GIs stationed in Germany and German civilians, particularly German children. It's really easy to state a policy and say that you're going to adhere to this policy and you're not going to provide any food. But it's totally different when you are living among these people, even though you're separated from them, but you see them. And it's hard to ignore children who are barefoot, who are scrounging around in rubble, who are asking American soldiers for not only sweets, but food in general. And, there's countless instances of soldiers who kind of, there's a story from Christmas 1945, and it's actually told by Stanley Andrews, who was the head of food and agriculture in occupied Germany. He tells a story about a number of soldiers who saved their candy rations for the entire month of December. They went to the PX, they got everything, they loaded their pockets, and then they took the trams throughout the city. And they started handing out all these sweets to children. And it made them feel good. And this was something that was repeated throughout cities and throughout that first few months of the occupation. There's instances where I have actually interviewed German adults, grandparents now, great-grandparents, who have told me stories of the first Coca-Cola they ever had. Being handed what they thought was an orange, and it turned out it was a grapefruit, and that was a big disappointment when they bit into it. But so there's all these stories about these really unofficial exchanges of food, and I think that they kind of speak to the emotional impact. And I talked a lot today about how the military was trying to calculate everything, but at the end of the day, the best measure for success ended up being the impact that it had on individual German lives, as well as American lives who felt good, American people who felt good for donating, for developing these relationships with German civilians. Again, a care package, you had to have an address, you had to have an actual recipient in order to purchase one. So this was creating a connection. GIs left service, they went back to the United States, they kept in touch with German civilians, they provided them with care packages for years afterwards. And so really, it's a way of looking at how food facilitates these relationships and these connections that are incredibly emotional. And I think that, you can measure the success of food programs based on how high the ration count goes, how many tons of food were provided, whether it was better quality of food or a better variety. But at the end of the day, really the best success is the way people talked about the programs later. And to this day, you can still hear people speak fondly of it.
It's funny you should say that, because Julia writes in and says, when I studied in Germany in 1991, 2 times, who told me how grateful they were for the assistance from the U.S. after the war. They were children during these times, so I took it as a reflection of their family's gratitude. And yes, one family told me of getting chocolate from the soldiers. But the idea of saving up your candy supply for a month at Christmas and then handing it out to starving children, it always puts me in mind of the holiday canned food drive. Like that people that are in need only get hungry in December. So who is that really helping? Is it helping me putting the can of peas in the pot for the poor, for the folks that are needing it? Or what happens in July when nobody's thinking of that and people are hungry then? Was there an ongoing effort by the average GI over there to do that, or was it just a holiday feel good kind of a thing?
I mean, I think it got a lot more attention during the holidays. But yeah, you did see these programs persist. The military was responsible for creating the German Youth Activities, which was an organization. It was kind of providing like after school activities, athletic resources, things like that for children, kind of as a place for them to gather, basically, to eliminate any sort of fears or concerns about growing juvenile delinquency. But it was also a place where you could teach German youth about democracy. You could teach them baseball, and at every German Youth Activities Center, there was food. And so it was definitely a way to kind of keep that going throughout the year. And you see that reflected too in the Hoover school feedings. That was something that, it was cyclical. It was constantly, children went to school, and every Tuesday and Thursday or whatever the calendar situation was, they would get almonds and hot cocoa. And that was because it could boost their calories for the day.
Mm-hmm. Scott wants to know, given the destruction in the Soviet Union, how big a threat was it really that the Soviets would be able to provide this food? And I think they're referring to the Lucius Clay's, 1,500 calories, you're a communist, 1,000 calories, you're into democracy. How realistic was it that the Soviets would be able to provide this food?
So, I mean, they like to say they could. And I think, one of the things that's really interesting is the Soviets were very concerned with image. And I think that's one of the reasons why the Berlin blockade ends up fizzling out, is it became really clear that the Soviet Union said they could supply Berlin, they could provide enough, and that the Berliners would be better off with the Soviets. But at the end of the day, the counter blockade that was enforced by the Allies, that wouldn't allow any food products or coal to go into East Germany, the Soviet zone, ended up causing a real pinch on their resources, their supplies. And so one of the things that's really interesting to me is the fact that most of what the Soviet Union was able to provide within their zone was reflective of, the numbers that they had even back in the Soviet Union. It was not, what the United States loved to do was look at it as, this is American abundance compared to Soviet scarcity. And that's why those are the merits of the capitalist system. You too can partake in this cornucopia and have access to all of these things if you embrace democracy.
Mm-hmm. One of the things that I find so interesting is, this idea of, Roosevelt's 4 freedoms. Because there was, I think, some talk that if there was to be a 5th freedom, it would be freedom to have food, but it was kind of consumed or insumed underneath the idea of freedom from want. Had Roosevelt lived, and I know there's no way you would know this for certain, but he was constantly thinking of the post-war period. What are we going to do next? And then, in fact, that's part of the reason he lays out the four freedoms. What happens next? Any indication of what Roosevelt would have done to feed Europe? It falls, as so many things, it falls to Truman to sort of carry on the rest of the way. But what was Roosevelt thinking about this?
So there are two things I can say for certain. One is Roosevelt very clearly articulated the fact that he thought soup kitchens would be a good thing for Germany, that having, hunger would be a daily reminder not to start another world war. He said this out loud more than once. He spoke about it among the cabinet. He had conversations with his son-in-law, John Bodegar, about it. And that was something, and specifically his soup kitchen line, that's what he uses, which I think is something that would resonate with post-Depression era Americans. Mm-hmm. And then the other thing is, I do not think that Roosevelt would have ever reached out to Herbert Hoover at all.
Right.
I just think that there was no way that he would reach across party lines, and especially not to Hoover of all people. There was too much bad blood there.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right. In fact, Hoover was never invited back to the White House during the Roosevelt administration. And the story goes that when Harry Truman became president, there was only one other living president, which was Hoover. So there's only one other guy on the planet that understood the burdens and the tremendous, problem of being president. And that when he invited Hoover back to the White House, Hoover actually had tears in his eyes that he was being welcomed back in. I found it'd be really, fascinating to think of it from this perspective. He did a great job of putting this into sort of a parallel look at the post-war period. This idea of, well, we're not going to feed you guys to help you guys. We're going to feed you guys so that you don't create a problem for our occupying forces, so that they're not getting sick, so that they're not getting attacked. That's a really what turned you to what brought you to that conclusion, or what? It's an incredible way of looking at it.
Yeah. So one of the things that I found really interesting was the fact that I had come across this story about these, I think they were called Bring Daddy Home clubs. And I didn't realize that after the war was over, there were so many Americans who just could not fathom keeping a military force in Europe for a prolonged period of time. They were like, we gave our due, basically. Our sons, our husbands, our fathers, they fought, they survived, they should be able to come home now. And so there was really a lot of hesitation and anxiety about this prolonged occupation, and especially the fact that there was no set end date. Like, no one knew what was going to happen. And as tensions continued to grow with the Soviet Union, there was a lot of fear and insecurity about the purpose of the U.S. military, and not only in Germany, but just throughout Europe at that moment in time. Were they there as a precautionary measure? Were they there to respond to an act of aggression? And so I think that, it was all about trying to get the American public to be accepting of this new role, basically, and to have a standing army. That was something that just was kind of novel and new. And I think Americans today take it as a normal thing. They don't understand how it really wasn't that long ago that after a war, you demobilized, everyone went home, and that was that.
Right. Yeah, I've heard, I forget which historian it was, but said that, people failed to understand that the American Army of 1945 was not the American Army of 1941. And meaning that, we did emerge from the war as a global power. We emerged from the war as, it wasn't like just pack your bags and go home and we're just going to stay on the other side of the ocean anymore. We had a responsibility. Whether we liked it or not, we were there, and we had to take care of some of this. Was there any, I know, like, in the First World War, they called them war gardens to try to grow food to feed the troops and the Allies. And then during World War II, it switched to a more positive idea of being a victory garden. Was there any talk of a peace garden of, okay, we're not just going to bring in these boxes of food, but, here, you grow your own stuff? Or was the population just so devastated at that point that there's no way that could have been done?
Are you speaking about the German population?
Yeah, the European
Yeah.
population.
There are some great photographs of the Reichstag in Berlin right after the war, and it's just a bare bones structure at that point. And then within a year or two, there's a photo that's taken, and it shows gardens. The entire building is surrounded by gardens, and that's German citizens, like Berliners, who are planting food. And they're using this space, this open space, to create these community gardens, in a sense. And the United States military, especially like the Civil Affairs Division, they had a bunch of experts who were providing things like seeds, teaching Germans proper canning techniques with, lack of resources. Like how could you preserve food if you don't have certain materials at hand? There was an entire corn mission that was created, because corn is not something that is a normal part of the German diet. And corn we had in excess. And so lots of corn was shipped to Germany, and there were women in the United States who contributed to cookbooks teaching Germans how to incorporate corn in their cooking. And it was something that was really important because there was this huge cultural divide. Many Germans looked at corn as animal feed. They found it offensive that it would be sent to them as food. And so there was this entire project, basically, and it was led by this woman named Jane Ebbs, to try to convince Germans of the nutritional value of corn, which I think we can say today is very little. Our food science has evolved. But back then it was really important to get the Germans to buy into this, that corn was something that you could eat, and you could create a number of amazing dishes with it.
Yeah, corn doesn't have a lot of nutritional value unless you turn it into a corn dog, in which case then you've got total nutrition. Dave wants to know, what about you? You focus on the situation in Europe. What about the situation in the Pacific? Was the same kind of thing going on for Japanese areas that are places that the Japanese had occupied, and we had gotten control back over? What was that like for Japan?
Yeah, there was similar food shortages there, absolutely. And again, looking at the global food supply situation after the war, it was abysmal. There are constant food shortages throughout British India at the time, the Bengal famine, things like that, of that nature. And specifically in Japan, it was a slightly different scenario, because there it was just the United States. It was not something where Japan was divided by 4 different occupying powers. And as a result, the situation didn't get as dire as quickly, but there were still some really interesting stories that have come out of there, and there's been some really great research that's been done. I know a scholar who's been working on hydroponics in Japan, and how the US military was really big on providing food for its occupying force, especially once the war in Korea breaks out. And there was a lot of distrust of Asian agriculture, and whether or not it was, quote, sanitary, and whether it would provide proper nutrients for American military men serving overseas. And so there's definitely a discourse there about race and hygiene, and it's very interesting, the work that is being done to kind of explore this. And so I would recommend looking into some of that material.
What's next for you, Kate? You've got this manuscript in progress, but I know how you scholars are. You've always got the next thing boiling back there somewhere. What happens next for you?
I like the food stuff, and I actually think I would love to explore gastro diplomacy a little bit more, specifically looking at presidential administrations and how they orchestrate state dinners. Whether it's the menu, whether it's the seating chart, there's so many different intricacies involved and policies happening at these dinners, but it's also influenced by, who's there, who's seated next to who, what are we eating? FDR's hot dog summit, having King George visit him in Hyde Park and eat, America's food, the hot dog. That is something that I think there's a cultural angle there, but there's also very definitely a political lens. And I think that that's worth exploring more.
It's interesting because, you often hear the term an army travels on its stomach, but the point you seem to be making is that diplomacy travels further on its stomach. If you can feed people, it's a great way to win them over to your ideology there as well. Kate, you've given us a lot of great things to think about. And, one of the things when my children were growing up, we never allowed them to say the term, I'm starving, because you're not starving. You may be hungry, but you are not starving. And you did a nice job of pointing out the difference between starvation and hunger and how to be able to tell those things as well. So thank you so much for spending this hour with us, giving us so much to think about. We look forward to the manuscript being turned into an actual publication and hearing more about you as you go through the rest of your career. So thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
Wonderful.